This is part 4 and the final part of our Serial Victims episodes. So far, we've told you about the murders of 8 sex workers: Diane McAnally, Karen McGregor, Leona McGovern, Marjorie Roberts, Jacqueline Gallagher, Margot Lafferty, Tracey Wylde and Emma Caldwell, their subsequent investigations and the murder trials that occurred, with only Margot Lafferty having received justice so far when 19-year-old Brian Donnelly was convicted of her murder in 1998. But in 2014, following a cold case review of Tracey Wylde's murder, police believed that that was about to change. Would they be right? Sugat Mukherjee arrived in Glasgow from India in August 1997, where he was enrolled in a nautical studies degree at Glasgow College, living on campus. Sugat enjoyed his time in Glasgow and enjoyed meeting new people, although he wasn't enjoying his course. However, he persevered. Although following being attacked and mugged by a gang and being interviewed by police over allegations of indecency in a public place, Sugat decided that he'd had enough. He wasn't happy, and so about 8 months after arriving in Glasgow and about 5 months after Tracey Wylde had been found murdered, he dropped out of his course and flew back home to India, where he quickly decided that he wanted to take his career in a different direction, and so he started a degree in computer science. Shortly after arriving back in India and beginning his new degree, he met a woman called Satna, and the pair quickly fell in love, married, and began planning for their future together. Upon finishing his degree, Sugat secured a job as an overseas operations manager, travelling around the world, and he enjoyed this job immensely and was very successful, staying in the role for 10 years. And Sugat and his wife and their 3 children lived a comfortable, happy life and were popular in their community. Despite enjoying his job, Sugat decided he wanted a new challenge and wanted to spend more time at home with his growing family, and so in 2012 he began a new job in business development. Sugat excelled in this role also, and life was good for the Mukherjee family. Little did they know that 2 short years later, their life would be left in tatters. As we know, cold cases are periodically reviewed to see if any new lines of inquiry can be gleaned from the evidence collected, or if advances in forensics can be applied to see if any new evidence can be extracted. Well, in 2013, Tracey Wylde's murder inquiry was one of the cold cases to be reviewed, and as DNA and fingerprints had been found on Tracey's body, this line of inquiry was looked at. Sadly, though, a match was not found. However, another potential line of inquiry was discovered. At the time of the initial investigation into Tracey's murder, her case was featured on the programme Crime Watch, where CCTV footage images were released that showed Tracey with a mystery man, and an appeal was made to the public to come forward if they could identify this man, suggesting that this man could have been a student in the city. And according to an article in the Daily Record in February 2016, the police received a phone call from a woman who, while she didn't have a name for the man in the CCTV footage images, believed that he lived in student accommodation in Glasgow. But at the time of the initial murder investigation, this line of inquiry didn't go anywhere. But with cold case detectives in 2013 having no other leads to go on, they looked further into this, which included gathering details of all foreign students who had been in Glasgow at the time of Tracey's murder. Having painstakingly worked through this list for over a year, hoping that Tracey's murderer would be one of these men, in August 2014 there appeared to have been a breakthrough, as an arrest warrant was granted by Glasgow Sheriff Court and an extradition application was made by the British High Commission. The suspect's name was Sugat Mukherjee. This development in Tracey Wylde's murder case was great news for her remaining family. If you remember, Tracey had been brought up by her grandparents, as Tracey's mum, Faye, was a teenager when she had Tracey and she didn't feel able to cope. Sadly, Tracey's grandparents had passed away, leaving only Tracey's mum, Faye, and Tracey's daughter, Megan, who had been 3 years old at the time of her mum, Tracey's murder, to continue to be stuck in limbo, waiting for Tracey to receive justice. So upon hearing that a warrant had been issued for a suspect, they would have dared to believe that justice was just around the corner. And so they waited, and waited, and waited. with Tracey's mum Faye saying in an article in the Daily Record in February 2016, a year and a half after the arrest warrant was granted, that she feared she would die before seeing her daughter's killer brought to justice, as she was suffering from terminal lung cancer. Sadly, Tracey's mum Faye wouldn't see her daughter Tracey receive justice, but Tracey's daughter Megan would, although Tracey's murderer wouldn't turn out to be who everyone had expected it to be. So, after an arrest warrant was issued in August 2014, naming Sugat Mukherjee as a suspect in Tracey's murder, what exactly happened? Well, it wasn't good. And just before I tell you what happened, I'd like you to try and put yourself in Sugat's shoes. You're just living your life, minding your own business, working hard, raising kids if you have them, spending time with friends and family, and going on well-deserved holidays if you are lucky enough. Just living a normal life. And then you're arrested for a murder that you did not commit. So let me tell you just what Sugat and his family went through. Unbeknownst to Sugat, upon Indian authorities receiving the arrest warrant from Scotland, Mumbai police kept him under surveillance for 4 months, before, on the 9th of January 2015, Sugat, who was 37 years old, was arrested and charged with Tracey Wylde's murder. He was taken to and held at the maximum security Mumbai Central Prison, where he was interrogated about his time in Glasgow and about Tracey's murder, which he denied all knowledge about, saying in an article in The Sun in April 2019 that, "I never met Tracey. The first time I ever saw her was when I was shown a picture in jail." Sugat spent over 3 weeks in the Mumbai Central Prison, saying that, "I was in prison for 24 days alongside dangerous criminals. The pavements in Glasgow was 100 times cleaner than the floor I was sleeping on." Mumbai Central Prison, also known as Arthur Road Jail, does have quite the reputation. And according to Wikipedia, it's the largest and oldest prison in Mumbai and houses most of the city's prisoners. Although it was originally built to accommodate 800 prisoners, the average number of inmates is roughly 2,900. So to say it's overcrowded would be an understatement. And the sanitation is very poor. 3 weeks Sugat had to spend there, and he was completely innocent. He was eventually bailed on the 30th of January, on the condition that he surrendered his passport and attend the local police station once a week. But Sugat and his family's problems had only just begun. So you'll be thinking that the Scottish police investigating Tracey's murder must have had a good reason to request an arrest warrant for Sugat. I mean, there was CCTV footage of Tracey likely with her killer, there was DNA found on Tracey and her bra, and apparently, which wasn't revealed at the time, there was dental evidence too. Tracey's killer had also bitten her on the chest, and he had protruding teeth. So the police must have been sure that Sugat was their man. There must have been evidence that pointed to this, right? Well, let me tell you what they had on him. So the CCTV footage showed Tracey with a man said to be about 30 years old, 5 foot 9 inches or 1.75 metres, with dark hair and wearing a cream-coloured jacket and jeans. And from this footage, police had apparently determined that the man seen with Tracey had a 40-inch waist. Sugat did not match this description. He was 19 at the time he was in Glasgow, not 30, and he apparently had a 22-inch waist when in Glasgow, not 40 inches. So if they hadn't identified Sugat from the CCTV, it must have been from the DNA or dental evidence. Well, apparently Sugat did have similar protruding teeth to that of Tracey's killer. And so a sample of Sugat's DNA was taken and sent to Scotland to be compared to the DNA found on Tracey. And Sugat knew it wouldn't match. And so despite having spent 3 weeks in a horrendous prison, having lost his job, and it being reported in newspapers that he was a rapist and killer, Sugat firmly believed that the nightmare he had found himself in would soon be over. Surely it wouldn't take the Scottish police long to determine that the DNA didn't match, and he would be cleared, right? Wrong. The hope that Sugat would hear pretty quickly that the Scottish police had made a mistake and his extradition would be retracted didn't come. But what also didn't come from Scotland was the proper documents for extradition. with the Central Bureau of Investigations, which according to an article in the Daily Record in 2016, is India's premier investigating agency, who had taken over Sugat's case from police, saying that we are awaiting a charge sheet that specifically says what the charges are and why he is being tried. And Scotland's Crown Office was apparently unable to provide a timescale. This was in February 2016, over a year since Sugat had been arrested, a year where it had hung over his head that he may at any moment be extradited to Scotland for a murder he did not commit. This took a massive toll on Sugat and his family, but it wasn't just that was taking a toll on them. Since losing his job due to his arrest, Sugat had been unable to find other work. He desperately tried to find another job, any job, but as soon as he disclosed the situation he was in, then suddenly he was no longer a suitable candidate. The Mukherjee family really began to struggle financially, and his wife's parents, along with Sugat's own family, who had continued to rally around Sugat and his family as they believed in his innocence, began to support them financially as well as emotionally. However, despite all this support from their family, the local community, having also read what was being said in the newspapers, began to make their feelings clear about having a murderer in their midst. And when Sugat's children started having problems at school due to the awful stories that were being printed in the press about him, the family decided they had to leave their home and move to a different area, eventually moving in with Sugat's parents, leaving the Mukherjee family with nothing. With Sugat saying in a BBC article in 2019, "I have gone from riches to rags. I am as good as a beggar in my life." Sugat became depressed. He was stressed, for which he was on a variety of medication for. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and eventually he stopped attending family events, preferring to shut himself away, alone, thinking, "What the hell happened to me?" Only leaving the house for his weekly visit to the local police station to report in. The shocked and shattered Mukherjee family, whose reputation had been tarnished, possibly irreparably, continued to have the threat and fear of extradition for a murder Sugat did not commit hanging over them, while the Scottish police did and said nothing for 5 years. And it was only by pure chance that Sugat had any idea of what was transpiring in Scotland while he sat in a deep depression in India. Back in Glasgow in July 2018, a man was arrested and held on suspicion of assault, at which point his fingerprints were taken, as was routine, and then entered into the database. And there was a hit. The system had flagged up that the fingerprints that had just been entered into the system matched with fingerprints and DNA that had been found on the body or in the flat of murder victim 21-year-old Tracey Wylde back in November 1997. After an initial murder inquiry that lasted 2.5 years and a cold case review in 2013 that had initially turned up nothing, only for an arrest warrant to then be granted for Sugat Mukherjee in 2014, could Tracey's murderer have finally been caught? Jimin Chen arrived in Glasgow at the age of 23 as an illegal immigrant in 1995, having left his home in China due to fearing human traffickers. On arriving in Glasgow, he worked cash-in-hand jobs and lived a lonely and solitary life, using the services of sex workers. He continued to live in Glasgow, got married in 2004, went on to have 2 children before he opened a Chinese takeaway and became a respected member of the community. Upon being questioned about his involvement in Tracey Wylde's murder, Jimin Chen denied any involvement. However, he did admit that he lived in Glasgow at the time of Tracey's murder and had used the services of sex workers around the same time. However, he was charged with Tracey's murder and was remanded in custody. In November 2018, Jimin Chen appeared at the High Court in Glasgow, where he was officially charged with biting Tracey Wylde on the chest, struggling with her, before compressing her throat with his hands and strangling her to death, to which Jimin Chen's QC, Donald Finlay, pleaded not guilty on his behalf. A trial date was set for the 24th of April 2019. As the trial date approached, Tracey Wylde's remaining family prepared themselves to hear what had been done to Tracey and hope that her killer would be brought to justice. Well, they needn't have worried, as on the first day of the trial, Jimin Chen's QC, Donald Finlay, entered into a guilty plea on his client's behalf. Jimin Chen finally admitted to murdering Tracey Wylde at her flat in 1997. But why had his plea changed? Well, according to an article in the Daily Record in April 2019, Jimin Chen had evidently admitted to his counsel that he had actually been with Tracey at her flat the night she died, that the pair had begun fighting and it turned violent. Jimin Chen said that he feared Tracey would call the police, which could lead to his arrest and deportation to China, and so he said he choked Tracey before fleeing the scene. However, he continued by saying that he believed Tracey was still alive when he had left her flat, and so his QC Donald Finlay had recommended he plead not guilty until this had been looked into. However, when it was looked into, it was discovered that this likely was not the case, at which point his QC advised him to plead guilty, which he did. Upon entering into a guilty plea, Judge Lord Arthurson told him that the only sentence he could pass down was one of life imprisonment, but that he would receive the punishment part of his sentence the following month. Tracey's family would have been delighted that Jimin Chen had finally pled guilty and spared them weeks of a trial. However, they were too upset to comment outside of the court that day, but it was reported in an article in the Guardian newspaper that they never lost faith that this day would come. Although it was sad that Tracey's mother Faye had never witnessed this, as she had sadly passed away 2 years prior. Jimin Chen appeared again in front of Judge Arthurson to receive his sentence on the 17th of May 2019, where, according to Glasgow Live, he was told by the judge that his murder of Tracey Wylde was brutal and cowardly, and that you proceeded to enjoy the prime years of your adult life in undetected freedom, including establishing a family and a business. The judge then told him the punishment part of his life sentence would be a minimum of 20 years. He was then led away. Following the sentencing, Tracey's daughter Megan, who was then 25, said in an article in the BBC that Jimin Chen should have handed himself into the police immediately after the murder, as it would have saved my family a lot of pain over the last 22 years. She was pleased that justice had finally been served, feeling that she could now get on with the rest of her life. Although that wouldn't be the case just yet, as Jimin Chen and his QC Donald Finlay immediately appealed against the sentence, claiming, according to an article in the BBC News in October 2019, that Judge Lord Arthurson had misinterpreted the law in fixing the punishment part of the sentence, arguing that other people who had committed crimes similar to Jimin Chen, who also had no previous convictions, had not received such lengthy punishment part of their sentences. And 3 appeal judges agreed with this. And so 5 months after being handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years, Jimin Chen's sentence was reduced to a minimum of 16 years before being eligible to apply for parole. Members of Tracey's family who were present wept at this decision. I hope, despite this, that Tracey's daughter Megan is able to get on with her life. Back in India, it wouldn't be until July 2018 that Sugat, while on his mobile, happened to receive a Google News alert saying that Jimin Chen had been arrested for Tracey Wylde's murder. He quickly discovered that neither the Central Bureau of Investigations in India or his solicitor had any idea about the arrest, having had no communication from Scotland for quite some time. Sugat had been arrested and demonised for a crime he did not commit, then left to suffer ongoing worry, anxiety, torture and upheaval in his life, all because the Scottish police did not have the decency to rectify the mistake when they realised that his DNA did not match the DNA found on Tracey. Sugat said in an article in the Sun newspaper that the only reason the police had to suspect him was because he left in the middle of his studies, saying, "I might have failed my course, but it doesn't make me a killer." He went on to say, after Jimin Chen had pleaded guilty, that "I am deeply sorry for the loss to their family and that her daughter had grown up without a mother," going on to say that justice has been done. We don't have the right to take away someone's life. Sugat has never received an apology from Glasgow police, and was only officially notified that he had been exonerated in a letter from India's Department for External Affairs on the 1st of May 2019, where it stated that there would be no further proceedings against Sugat Mukherjee. And that was it. Sugat said in an article in 2019 that despite what had happened shattering him and his family, now that he was completely exonerated, he was desperate to rebuild his life. His wife just hopes it's possible, saying that the whole thing had left her husband broken and that we are still suffering and it's still not over for us. When Sugat is alone, he sometimes thinks about what would have happened to him if Jimin Chen had not been caught, saying, "I would have died and gone to my grave and been called a murderer." As Sugat begins the journey to rebuild his life, he still has unanswered questions. Why did the Scottish police not clear his name as soon as they received his DNA sample and realised it was not a match? And why did they leave the extradition application hanging over him for 5 long years when he was not their killer? He also asks himself who is responsible for the financially dire situation he and his family are now in, and should there be compensation? If Sugat does decide to seek compensation for what he has been through, I wish him good luck. I have a feeling he will need it. So, now we know that 2 sex workers received justice, Margot Lafferty and Tracey Wylde, but what about the 6 other sex workers that had been murdered? Well, if you remember, 2 men, Gary and Daga, were arrested and charged for Diane McAnally's murder, and then released again the next day. And Joe Jackson, who had been the lead detective in Diane McAnally's murder inquiry and had since retired, speculated in the Glasgow Times on the 31st of March 2021 that while he still didn't understand why the Procurator Fiscal had changed his mind, as he had never been told, he wondered if it had been due to the victim, Diane McAnally, being a sex worker, and the Procurator Fiscal didn't want to go ahead with an expensive trial that they didn't think they could win. He went on to say in the same article that he believes Diane was murdered due to not passing on the money to Gary and Daga for the pills she had been selling for them, with Joe Jackson believing that most of the violence on the night of the murder was by Gary Moore, but that Daga would have been standing there watching it, believing that Daga would have been too scared to ever say who had murdered Diane for fear of repercussions. Joe Jackson is quite satisfied that the 2 men we charged were the 2 that murdered Diane McAnally. Despite his belief, officially Diane McAnally's murder is still unsolved. According to the Daily Record on the 13th of March 2016, in 1994, almost 3 years after Diane's murder, Gary Moore was convicted of killing the son of a reformed murderer and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Before his death in 2010 from liver damage, Gary Moore admitted that he had been with Diane hours before she had died and that they had argued, but that he had not killed her. Daga died of a drug overdose in 1997, 6 years after being briefly charged with Diane's murder. But more importantly, what became of Diane's family? Her son Craig was only 6 years old when his mum was brutally murdered. 2 years after Diane's murder, Craig's grandparents, Diane's mum, Lynn, and stepdad, John, adopted Craig and moved to England to try and give Craig a fresh start. Craig didn't find out what had become of his mum until he was 16 years old. Diane's parents, siblings, and aunt had continued to fight to get Diane justice. However, Craig's aunt, Dolly, reported in an article in the Daily Record on the 13th of March 2016 that Diane's mum, Lynn, dad Roger, stepdad John, sister Angela, and brother Stephen had all since died without ever getting justice for Diane, and Dolly vowed she would continue to fight. In the same article, it was reported that Diane's son Craig, then 30, was believed to be living in London and was a father to 4. In 2021, the 30th anniversary of Diane's murder, cold case detectives said they were still committed to bringing those responsible for Diane's murder to justice and vowed that they would solve Diane's murder, with Detective Chief Inspector Brian Geddes from Police Scotland saying in an article in the Glasgow Times on the 31st of March 2021 that the passage of time is no barrier to the continued investigation, and that the death of Diane McAnally remains an unsolved murder, but it is not a closed case. Although with Joe Jackson still being convinced that Diane's murderers were Gary Moore and Dale Daga Clark, both of whom are now dead, I'm not sure where the investigation could go. Now, following Karen McGregor's husband Charlie being on trial in February 1995 for the charge of murdering his wife Karen, he remained pretty quiet until the 21st of August 1995, when an article in the Daily Record was titled "Hubby's Plea on Vice Girl Murders." In this article, he urged sex workers in Glasgow to help solve the then murders of Diane McAnally, his wife Karen McGregor, Leona McGovern, and Marjorie Roberts, believing that they held information which could help find their murderer or murderers. He went on to say that it would make anybody sick that 4 women can be murdered in the same area, but it's especially bad for me. It brings it all back. The way these lasses work, they must have seen something. Whether it was Karen or one of the others, somebody must have seen them getting into a car and never coming back. I would appeal for them to come forward. Also in this interview, it was stated that Charles, or Charlie, who continued to maintain his innocence, was now addicted to tranquilizers, suffered from depression, and was now living with another sex worker, saying that his life had not been the same since Karen's death, but that he was attending a clinic to fight his addiction, and he hoped to win custody of Karen's children, Stephanie, who was then 6, and Jamie, who was 4. However, Charles died not long afterwards, and Karen's murder still remains unsolved. Now, I mentioned that it was revealed years later that before George Walker had been arrested after Leona McGovern was murdered, another man had been questioned and investigated by police in connection with her murder, and that he had been known to trawl Glasgow's red light district. Well, this man was the now disgraced Father Jerry Nugent, who had been the priest at St Patrick's Catholic Church in Glasgow at the time 23-year-old Angelica Klook's body had been found under the floorboards after Peter Tobin had murdered her in 2006. At the time, Peter Tobin was going by the name of Pat McLaughlin, and Father Nugent actually hired him to work as a handyman at the church. Well, he was apparently a key witness at Peter Tobin's trial in 2007. However, this is also when it began to be revealed exactly what Father Jerry Nugent was like, although he tried to dodge answering awkward questions and continually changed his story. And so after the trial, he was sentenced to 100 hours of community service. At Peter Tobin's trial, Father Nugent admitted that he had a drink problem and had had sex with a number of women, including having sex with murder victim Angelica Klook 3 or 4 times, being sexually intimate with a parishioner, and having a string of affairs. Okay, so that's not the end of the world, you might say. However, that was only the tip of the iceberg. He was also known, back in the 90s, to trawl Glasgow's red light district and admitted to sexual fumbling with sex workers in church residences. But still, it got worse. It was revealed that there had been allegations of inappropriate sexual assault made against him in 1993, the year Diane McAnally was murdered, and 2 years before Leona McGovern was murdered. But while he was confronted by a cardinal about this, and Father Nugent was sent for psychological assessment, this flagged up no issues with regard to his sexual conduct. Father Nugent died in 2010 from a heart attack, but not before the police confirmed that there were historical allegations from as far back as 40 years prior of child sexual abuse against the priest, and that an investigation had been launched. A spokesperson for the church said in an article in the Sun newspaper on the 15th of June 2018 that Father Nugent is now dead. He was removed from parish ministry as soon as the extent of his totally inappropriate sexual behaviour with adults became apparent during the Angelica Klook murder trial in 2007. The allegations relating to minors only emerged after his removal. It may be that no one will ever know the full truth of all Father Nugent's wrongful conduct and criminal actions. Father Nugent was certainly on Glasgow Police's radar in the 90s, and he was interviewed in relation to the murders of Leona McGovern and Emma Caldwell. Could he perhaps have been more involved in the 90s sex worker murders than anyone could have imagined? Now, back in August 1995, sex worker Marjorie Robertson's body was found in the River Clyde, and a report had been sent to the Procurator Fiscal naming a possible suspect. So, was there enough evidence provided for an arrest to be made? Sadly, no, there wasn't. But it wouldn't be until the 2nd of June 2015 that police finally said that they were closing the inquiry into 34-year-old Marjorie's death, as they had failed to determine if she had fallen or if she was pushed, saying in an article in the Daily Record that no criminality has been established. Although 2 days later, in an article in the Glasgow Times, a senior police officer was asking for people to come forward if they had any information about Marjorie's death, saying that people's loyalties may have changed and now is the time for anyone to come forward, and insisted that the case still remained open. It had been a long and agonising 20 years for Marjorie's family, a family that had been shattered by Marjorie's death and who had been stuck in limbo ever since, dealing with emotions of anger, frustration, and unbearable grief. But in the same article, Elizabeth, Marjorie's sister, appeared hopeful about the future, saying, "I feel we may finally get the answers we've been waiting for all these years." And Marjorie's sister, Elizabeth, wanting to continue the momentum in her sister's unsolved case, gave an interview in the Herald newspaper where she gave the name of the man she believed killed her sister, the man she dubbed the forgotten suspect. In the article she said, "I won't let him get away with this. My sister was murdered and the man who killed her is out there laughing at us, thinking he has got away with it. We know who he is. He is a beast and a monster. He robbed 3 young children of their mum and took away my sister. I won't allow my sister to be forgotten. She was murdered." Marjorie's family also can't understand and would like to know the answer to why the man who Marjorie had last been seen with, who lied and changed his story numerous times when questioned, was ruled out of their inquiry. Marjorie's family would just dearly love for police to look at this man again, saying, "We want justice, we want answers, we deserve it for Madge." In 2015, Marjorie's family met with police officers from Police Scotland who assured the family that the inquiry into Marjorie's death would never be closed, with a spokesperson for Police Scotland saying, "It is vitally important to us that Marjorie's family find out how she died, and that they remain committed to establishing the full circumstances around her unexplained death." However, it's now 2023 and there have been no further developments. Now, back in 2004, following George Johnston receiving a not proven verdict at Jacqueline Gallagher's murder trial, the then Strathclyde police issued a statement saying that they were not looking for any other suspect for the killing of Jacqueline Gallagher. However, in January 2022, the now Police Scotland stated in an article in the Glasgow Times that the file on Jacqueline's murder had never been closed, despite it being unresolved, and that they are still committed to bringing the person responsible for Jacqueline's murder to justice, despite the passage of time, going on to appeal again for anyone with information about either the curtain that Jacqueline had been found wrapped in or any other information to please come forward. Going on to say that the other sex worker murder cases are also subject to regular reviews and appeals for information, and that advances in technology are relentlessly pursued in helping to bring resolution to family members of the victims. However, as of writing this episode, Jacqueline Gallagher has still not received justice. Now, you'll remember that in 1998, 19-year-old Brian Donnelly had been found guilty of Margot Lafferty's murder. Well, in 2012, it was reported that Brian Donnelly was not only being prepared to be moved to a more open prison with less restrictions, but that he was being prepared to be released, and was leaving his current prison every day and working in a placement that had been found for him on the outside, having served 15 years for Margot's murder. Margot's family were not at all happy to hear this, with Margot's older brother saying, according to an article in the Herald newspaper, that he is sick and clearly a danger to women. If I see him outside, I'll do something about it. he should be under constant supervision, not out in public. Brian Donnelly was reported to have been terrified that he would be recognised by someone while working on the outside who would take revenge on him. There have been no further reports of what became of Brian Donnelly, so I assume he has since been released and likely moved away from the area where Margot's remaining large family lived. And that brings me to the murder of Emma Caldwell in 2005. As I said before, you will have noticed that while I told you as much as I could about Emma's life before she had been murdered, I didn't talk about the subsequent murder investigation. Well, that's because in February 2022, after Emma's murder case was reopened in 2015 following a campaign by Emma's mum, a man was arrested and charged with her murder. This man pleaded not guilty and lodged special defences of self-defence and incrimination, and a trial date has been set for January 2024. So I'm unable to say anything else about Emma's case at the moment due to our laws, but once the trial is over, I will finish the Serial Victims episodes by releasing an episode all about the investigation into Emma's murder, the trial, and of course the outcome of the trial. The debate continues today in Glasgow about the best way to ensure the safety of the city's sex workers and what support can and should be offered, with human trafficking and sex worker support agencies calling to decriminalise victims of sexual exploitation and wipe previous convictions for soliciting from their record, and instead place the burden of criminality onto buyers of sexual services. But according to an article in the BBC News in 2021, not all sex workers agree with this course of action, wanting instead to fully decriminalise sex work, believing this would be the safer option for them. It certainly appears to be a complex issue, and there doesn't appear to be an agreed-on solution in sight, leaving the vulnerable sex workers of Glasgow to continue to face nightly danger. I just want to end with something Marjorie's sister Elizabeth said in an article in 2015, as I felt she said beautifully what every sex worker murder victim's family would likely have been thinking and feeling. She said, "It was hard to see my sister labelled a prostitute and a hooker, because to her family she was a mother, a daughter, a sister, not a prostitute." Regardless of the work that Diane, Karen, Leona, Marjorie, Jacqueline, Margot, Tracey or Emma were doing, just remember it wasn't by choice, but by necessity. And most importantly, they were human beings who were loved, cared for, and missed so dreadfully by their family members. Well, it's been a mammoth undertaking researching and writing the Serial Victims episodes, but I hope it has given you an insight into the dangers that sex workers the world over face, and they, along with everyone else, do not deserve to be murdered. If anyone has any information about the unsolved or unresolved murders of these sex workers, please contact Police Scotland on 101 if you're in the UK, or contact Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111. Now to lighten the mood a wee bit with a
Dawn's Digest.
It's been quite a while since I've done one of these, and as a few things have happened recently that I'd like to share, I thought now was as good a time as any to bring it back. Well, first off, we have a new Patreon member. Thank you so much, Julian Hiles, for signing up to our The Wee Belter Yin tier. We really do appreciate your support. Your exclusive sticker will be winging its way to you in 3 months. And we made our first sale of Scottish Murders merch at TeePublic. I'm so excited that someone out there has bought a Scottish Murders t-shirt. If whoever bought the t-shirt is listening, I'd love it if you took a picture of you wearing it and tagged us on socials so we can share it. Thank you so much again, it made our day. If you would like to buy Scottish Murders merch, then go to teepublic.com/user/Scottish Murders. And if you also listen and enjoy our other podcast, Scottish Digest, well, you'll be pleased to know that you can now buy Scottish Digest merch by going to teepublic.com/user/Scottish Digest. All links will be in the show notes. It's been a month of exciting things happening, as Scottish Murders has also been shortlisted for the second time this year, this time in the True Crime category for the Independent Podcast Awards. We're absolutely delighted and are really looking forward to attending the awards ceremony in London at the end of October. Please keep everything crossed for us. We also have had a couple of really lovely reviews on Apple Podcasts this month. From CJ Lamb 12, who said, Scottish Murders is a fantastic show that does its research. A must listen. And from Murder and Mimosas, who said, I'm always looking for international cases, and I hit gold with this podcast. So many cases are something I've never heard before. I love it. Thank you to both these reviewers and everyone else who has given us a review. It means the absolute world to us. And finally, following the release of the recent episodes of me interviewing Catherine Schweit, we had some really lovely comments on YouTube. Brandy Jean 7015 said, excellent interview, always educational to listen to an intelligent, informed person. Serious topics honestly expressed, and she left us on a chuckle. Well played. And Leslie Begg 1287 said, really so informative and interesting. I can't thank you both enough for your comments. I don't do interviews very often and I am kind of shy, so to hear that people actually enjoyed the interviews and got something out of them means everything. Thank you. Okay, so that's almost it for this week. Join me next time for another episode of Scottish Murders.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.